scaling. So you know the success ground that we perceive these properties.
I want to assemble some relatively familiar points having to do with practical reason and the nature of human agency, which, when assembled in just this way, might make it seem both natural and right to conclude that the world contains value properties that make normative demands on us. I would hesitate to say that such a conclusion, suggested by considerations such as those I present, is properly called realism about values. Thus, for instance, for those who seek moral realist conclusions in order to repudiate a moral relativism, will find nothing on offer in my remarks to promote their cause. For all I say, there might be substantially differential perception of the value properties in the world by subjects from different cultural backgrounds, and should that ring alarm bells about a relativism in the offing, there'll be nothing in what I say today that could hush those alarms. I'm not by any means a relativist, but that is for reasons that will not be detectable in the points I'm about to assemble. And relativism apart, even some of the other standard themes and interests surrounding questions of realism, such as the mind independence of the reality at stake, will not be addressed by me, and in fact, it might appear to many that there's far too much mind dependence in the conception of values that I present. I don't myself think that the sort of mind dependence I allow does anything to cancel or even really to qualify the claim that values are genuine and irreducible properties in the world, but I realize that there are realists who will, even so, find the claim in these respects falling measurably short of what they conceive realism to be. There's nothing to do but to acknowledge that that might be so and proceed. I'll begin with a familiar distinction, sometimes attributed to Spinoza, between the character of predictions and the character of intentions. When one predicts that one will do something, one steps outside of oneself and looks at oneself as the object of behavioral and causal and motivational tendencies. One looks at oneself as another might look at one, and so this is sometimes called the third-person point of view on oneself. But when one intends to do something, one is asking, what should I do? What ought I to do? One is being an agent, not an observer of oneself. One is a subject rather than an object and for oneself, and that is why this is sometimes described as a first-person perspective on oneself. Even when intentions to do something are not formed as deliberatively decisional answers to explicit questions of this sort, they're distinctively within this first-person point of view by contrast with predictions of one's own behavior. I should register a caveat so that we're not misled by the terminology. The rhetoric of first person and third person might give the impression of being merely grammatical categories involving the first and third person pronoun, but the perspectival categories that the distinction between intention and prediction invokes are not grammatical but philosophical categories, and they do not coincide with the grammatical ones. Proof of this failure of coincidence can be found in examples such as when someone says, I predict that I will do something, where one grammatical term does double duty. The first occurrence of the first person pronoun I is an agentive use, and the second is not. For this reason, it may be sensible to replace the first-person point of view and third-person point of view with the engaged point of view or the detached point of view. With whatever terminology we describe it, the point is to put on record a relatively clear and sharp distinction between two points of view on oneself. Now, though as I've presented them, these are distinguishable points of view on oneself, I think there ought to be a similar distinction that holds for perspectives we have on the world. We have a detached perspective on it, a perspective of study as is paradigmatically found in the regiments of natural science. That's just one highly regimented aspect of the third-person point of view, and we have a perspective of practical agency on the world, one of responding to it with practical engagement rather than with detached observation and explanatory purpose. Here again, there's scope for being misled. The point is not that we are not agents when we are observing and explaining the world in scientific terms, but that we as agents are taking a perspective of detached observation or study on it rather than one of practical engagement. So these contrasting points of view one has can apply to oneself as well as the world. And I want to consider the latter now and ask a question: what must the world be like? What must the world contain such that it moves us to such practical engagement? If the world prompts such engagement, it must contain elements over and above those we observe and study from a detached point of view. The obvious answer to the question is that over and above containing the facts that natural science studies, it contains a special kind of fact, evaluative facts and properties, or more simply, it contains values. And when we perceive them, they put normative demands to us and activate our practical engagement. Values, being the sort of thing they are not primarily the objects of detached observation. They engage with our first rather than our third-person point of view on the world. On the world, not just on ourselves now. So it's an extension of what Spinoza said. Thus, if we extend in this way onto the world a presupposition of the fundamental distinction between intention and prediction, the presupposition of two contrasting perspectives that one has on oneself, we get a conception of values that's neither Humean nor Kantian. We get a conception of values recently attributed to Aristotle by John McDowell, by which they are not merely something we generate with our mental tendencies and then project onto the world, a metaphor found in Adam Smith and Hume, but they are properties that are found in the world of nature, of others who inhabit nature with us, and of a history and tradition that accumulates in the relations among these, and within which values understood as being in the world. So conceived, values are not dismissible either as mere inclinations, as Kant did of Hume's psychologistic conception of values, nor, since they are perceptible properties in the phenomenal world, precisely what Kant denied, are they quite as Kant envisaged them. At any rate, they need none of the gratuitous apparatus in Kant of the noumenal or of pure practical reason to describe them. It's not as if sympathy and moral sentiments, much stressed by Hume and Adam Smith, are left out of this picture, but sympathy and moral sentiments on this picture are our responses to the normative demands that we apprehend in our perceptions of the evaluative properties in the world. As I said, in recent years, McDowell has revived this apparently Aristotelian view of values, and what I've tried to do is merely to motivate this view by the most common sense considerations about what is distinctive about agency and its unique point of view. But motivating some conclusion may merely make it seem natural, something one could come to believe without strain, given the motivating factors. It doesn't yet approach the prestige of an argument. I think we can go a step further towards argument if we ask and attempt to answer the following question, intended as a challenge to this view. Why can't agency consist in nothing more than the fact that we try and fulfill our desires and intentions and so on? True, there is a first-person point of view that is activated and exercised in agency, but why can't it simply be exercised merely in our efforts to satisfy our desires and fulfill our intentions? Why do I insist that agency comes into play only when our desires and moral sentiments are responding to the callings of something external, the evaluative properties in the world? Why can't our characterization of desires have them be self-standing, independent of the need of such an external calling? That's the challenge, and I'll call it the challenger's view of desires and its relation to agency. To answer this challenge, we need to look a little harder at the relationship between desires and agency. Gareth Evans, in a now oft-cited passage, had said illuminatingly that questions put to one about whether one believes something, say whether it's raining outside, do not prompt us to scan our mental interiority to see whether we possess that belief. They prompt us to look outside and see whether it's raining. That is to say, one not only looks outside when one is asked, is it raining, but also when one is asked, do you believe it's raining? Now, I'd like to extend this insight and ask, is this true of questions put to one about whether one desires something? When someone asks, do you desire X, are we prompted to ponder our own minds, or are we prompted to consider whether X is desirable? Of course, X's desirability may not always be perceptible to us if X is not sensibly present to us, but I'm assuming that something like perception is basic, and that when we try and imagine the desirability of X, or just even reflect on it, these are capacities that depend on some background of past perceptions. If not of X itself, then perhaps ingredients of X, or things sufficiently approximating or analogous to X, and so on. This point is quite generally true of imagination, whether of value properties or any other kind of properties. In any case, to return to the question, what does one do when one is asked whether one desires X? And I think the answer is, extending Evans, that though there may be special sorts of case where we ponder our own minds, say when an analyst asks the patient to introspect on one of his desires, given that his behavior suggests a certain desire, for most ordinary cases, I think we should simply consider X's desirability. This suggests that our desires are often presented to us as having desirabilities in the world as their objects, which, putting subtle differences apart, might be just the thing that is intended by the Aristotelian picture of values that has been recently revived. But since it's an argument we are seeking to provide, we should persist a little more and ask, even if there's room for extending Evans's point about beliefs to many desires in this way, why is it so important to find it extendable in this way to desires? What makes it seem a philosophical necessity that we do so? Perhaps the best way to answer this question is to look critically at what would seem to follow if one thought that this extension of mine of Evans's point is wrong. If one thought that a question about whether one desires something never requires one to consider its desirability, but rather to step back and consider by scanning our minds whether we desire it, then that would suggest that our desires were presented to us in a way that was accessible to us only when our angle on ourselves was, to use my earlier term, in the third person. And here we need to go back to the Spinozist discussion of the two different points of view, not on the world, but on ourselves. If it is indeed true, as we said in that discussion, that practical agency is presented in the possession and exercise of the first person rather than the third person point of view on ourselves, then it would seem that to exercise our practical agency, the appropriate way to experience our desires cannot always be experienced by them as desired by us. It cannot always be to experience them as desired by us. What alternative way is there then for our desires to be present to us? And the answer, it would seem, would have to be by perceiving the desirability of what is desired. In short, if our desires were always experienced by us only as desired, our very agency would be in jeopardy. And it would only be restored if we found a way of saying that our desires are sometimes given to us not as desired, and therefore available only to the agency-threatening third-person point of view, but rather in the first-person point of view when we are perceiving the desirability of what we desire, where no stepping back is involved. It's only when we experience them in this latter form that we are in the perspective of the first person that carries our agency. In other words, when we step back and register that we desire something, that desire cannot induce the agentive aspect of our mentality. It sits there as the leaden object of our detached gaze. And so the challenge before us, with its claim that our agency consists in just our possession and pursuit of self-standing desires, is exposed as hollow, because it is only when our desires are not self-standing, but given to us via the desirabilities that are given to us in our perception, that desires will prompt in us the responses of our practical agency. If in order to be practical agents, we must be able to experience our desires not merely directly as elements located in our mentality, but via the perception of values or desirabilities in the world, what does this suggest about the nature of value properties in the world? Any answer to this would unearth what lies buried in my extension of Evans's point about beliefs to desires. So let me close this part of the paper with just a couple of brief remarks about that unearthing, that excavation. It would be helpful to recall here, by way of analogy, a view of human agency and responsibility that owes to the remarkable innovations on the subject in a rightly celebrated essay by P.F. Strawson. On Strawson's view, it is via our reactive attitudes, such as resentment, for instance, of what someone has done, that we may identify the agency and responsibility in his doings. There's no more direct certification of his agency. That thought in general suggests a complex relationship between our emotions directed at people and the facts about people's doings. Aristotle had said of emotions that are directed at others that they presuppose certain beliefs about others in the subjects who undergo emotions. Thus, for instance, he said that my anger at someone presupposes the belief that he has done me harm. Presupposes the belief that. But if Strawson is right, presupposes is the wrong description for what's going on here. If he's right, the relations are not quite like that. Rather, the relation is more like the one we find in some accounts of pain, physical pain. On these accounts, pain is a way of perceiving parts of one's body. So, take, for example, the proverbial toothache. We may perceive a tooth tactually by touching it with a finger. We may go to a mirror, uncurl a lip, and perceive it visually. But we may also, more internally and involuntarily, perceive it by, and here we run out of the logical grammar, paining it. And emotions are, in this sense, often similar. Often when we are angry with someone, it's not as if the belief that he has done one harm is all in place before the anger, as the idea of presupposition suggests. One's anger is just a way, rather, very often, of perceiving that he has done one harm. This is just the Strawson view applied to emotions. And I'm claiming that it's actually Strawson's view of emotions, because he talks of resentment, etc. And I'm claiming that the right view of the relationship between our desires and value properties in the world is something like that. I had said earlier that to be practical agents, we must often perceive values or desirabilities, and in doing so, experience our desires indirectly, rather than directly, as when we step back and scan our desires as elements of our mentality. And what that suggests is that desires are, just as in the Strawsonian picture I've elaborated briefly, are ways of, or conduits for perceiving the value properties in the external world. This shows that we need to be a little careful when we say that value properties in the world make a normative demand on us. It's not as if the value properties which prompt our desires are a source of normative promptings that are entirely alien to the kind of sensibility we have in having desires. Though they prompt our desires, it is through the desires they prompt that we even so much as see the normative demands they make on us. This is perhaps what is intended by the analogy that philosophers like McDowell make between values and secondary qualities, though the analogy as made by McDowell is severely underdescribed. At any rate, the point of importance is that if there was no complex relation of the kind I've been sketching that our desires bear to value properties without, we put into doubt the possibility of practical agency within us. In the argument I've presented for the conclusion that the world contains values, whether or not this comes up to the ideal of moral realism, the notion of agency has been crucial. The notion of practical agency requires that our desires are not self-standing, but rather are responses to normative demands made on our agency by these value properties in the world. But the conclusion of that argument, viz., that desires are not self-standing, is not merely the conclusion that our desires are responses to promptings from something or other that is external to them. The conclusion is that the external properties that prompt them are value or moral properties that make normative demands on our agency. But exactly for that reason, what is prompted by these external callings had better not be described in purely descriptive terms. Or to put it more specifically, the notion of desires in question better not be, as Saul Kripke might put it, interpreted in purely dispositional terms. For if desires are merely descriptively characterized states, such as dispositions, then it's not obvious that the entire picture that emerges is not a form of realism in which the value properties in the world can eventually be understood reductively in naturalistic terms, prompting in the sense of merely causing, of course they cause it, but merely causing our desires rather than making irreducibly normative demands on them by causing them. In general, the term desires, as we all perfectly well know, is ambiguous between desires conceived as genuinely and irreducibly intentional states which are themselves thought of in essentially normative terms, and desires conceived as dispositions or tendencies of nature, even if nature within us. The argument for irreducible value properties in the world is therefore incomplete until we have some reason to think that there's a notion of desires in play that is not to be thought of in purely naturalistic and dispositional terms. This subject is, as I've already hinted, a special case of a perfectly familiar issue brought to much philosophical attention in recent times by Kripke's book on rule following, where he insists much more cleanly than others who have taken similar irreducible normativist views of intentionality in general, that there's a firm distinction to be made between dispositions and genuinely normative states. Until the case for such a clean distinction is properly made out, we don't have a right to rule out the possibility that all I've established in the earlier argument I gave is that it is merely desires qua dispositions that are prompted in the merely causal sense of prompting by the merely naturalistically conceived value properties in the world. Only if we are able to establish by further considerations than I have given so far that what are prompted by the external value properties are genuinely normative states, i.e. our desires in the sense of something like commitments rather than dispositions, can we then satisfy ourselves that what has been established as properties in the world by the argument I gave earlier are genuinely, irreducibly value properties. Now, what might these further considerations be that could establish this essential conclusion? I've just used the word commitment, brought into currency in recent years by Robert Brandom, though the way I use it is really relatively modest and minimal and has nothing to do with the slightly specious framework of scorekeeping and so on that he embeds it in. So I've used this word commitment, brought into currency by Robert Brandom recently, in the way Kripke cleanly does, distinguishing between them and commitments and dispositions. Well, Kripke doesn't use the word commitments, but I'm reading that into what I was applauding by his clean distinction. That is to say, one way to make Kripke's contrast is to describe intentional states in their full dress normativity as commitments. I don't have the space to characterize commitments in detail in this short paper. I'm simply going to assume some such notion and try to provide a brief argument for why they're absolutely necessary in the way Kripke suggests, even though he doesn't use that word, as standing in radical conceptual contrast with desires understood in merely descriptive terms as dispositions. Let me begin by favorably comparing this claim for a clean distinction in Kripke with a much murkier position in Donald Davidson regarding the normativity of intentional states, focusing, since our subject is practical agency, on desires. Well before Kripke, Davidson had pointed out that there's a normative and an irreducibly normative character that is possessed by intentional states. But I repeat, because this is a point of real importance for me, what Kripke's remarks suggest is something much more clear and clean than is found in Davidson. The normativity of intentionality was essential to the argument of Davidson's celebrated paper, Mental Events, for the conclusion that intentional states are not reducible to physical states, that they are not type identical with physical states in the framework of that paper. But unlike Kripke, Davidson never saw clearly that intentional states, if they are normative, cannot be dispositions in any interesting sense. That is simply not a conclusion he ever drew from their normative character. In fact, he always claimed that intentional states are dispositions, and this he agrees with Quine, and he described the relevance of normative to them in the following way. Intentional states are dispositions which, unlike other dispositions, are constrained or governed by normative principles of rationality. These combinations of claims are, I think, obscure. What is this notion of constraining and governing that is done by normative principles of rationality, we might ask? How can states themselves thought of as states defined by tendencies of nature, as dispositions must be defined? How can, as Kripke puts it, states which are essentially characterized in descriptive terms, as dispositions are, be thought of as being constituted or governed by normative principles? Davidson doesn't pause to even ask these fundamental questions, despite his insightful insistence, a pioneer on this, on the relevance of normativity in intentional states. What makes Kripke's remarks much clearer is that he sees no way to see the states as both interestingly dispositional and normative at once. Interestingly dispositional and normative at once. I actually myself believe they are not interestingly dispositional, apart from being normative. And in this, Kripke is really bringing back to center stage the hallowed wisdom of G.E. Moore's open question argument. Moore's theme, of course, was not something as general or abstract as intentionality, but rather moral values in particular. It was Kripke's innovation, pursuing some remarks in Wittgenstein, to introduce the strategy of Moore's open question argument to our understanding of the normative element of the much more general question of intentionality. Moore's target of attack was certain naturalistic reductions of normative terms such as good and ought to terms describing external natural properties. He particularly targeted properties such as social aggregate utility in its Benthamite naturalist versions, though it's a question how external these would be in the end. It's irrelevant for now. But the argument, as Kripke and Wittgenstein are saying, applies equally to reduction of norms to internal naturalistic properties, such as mental dispositional properties. Thus, echoing Moore's argument, we might say that it is always a non-trivial question, always a question that is unlike asking, say, this is a bachelor, is he unmarried? To ask, I have this disposition to phi, but ought I to phi? If this is a genuinely non-trivial question, then that is something like a proof that our answer to it expresses a mental state of ours that is not a disposition. Intentional states are states such as this. They are internal oughts or ought-nots, commitments. Desires in this irreducibly normative rather than dispositional sense are oughts of this kind. In this sense, to desire something is to think that one ought to do various things, those things that are entailed by those desires, given certain other beliefs, by the light of certain normative principles, etc. It's not to be disposed to do those things, it's to think that one ought to do them. None of this means that dispositions do not have a lot to do with intentional states. They certainly do, but I won't try and spell out that complicated relationship now. Whatever those relations are, what is made possible by Kripke and Moore is to say that one may have a certain first-order intentional state, say the desire that one help the poor, which is a certain sort of commitment, even if one has no corresponding first-order disposition to do anything at all that would count as fulfilling the commitment to help the poor. Thus, there's no way to see an intentional state as being a dispositional state in any interesting sense, in any sense which would be counted as a naturalistic cancellation of the irreducibly normative element that we have introduced by seeing it as a commitment. Now, this simple argument so far, deep but simple, deep in all the ways that G.E. Moore is deep, is manifestly incomplete. Notice that Moore's open question argument, which is really what underlies Kripke's remarks that I cited earlier, or one of the things that underlies them, is effective and intended to be effective only against naturalisms which are definitional, which try and give, presumably non-arbitrary, stipulations about the natural properties good and ought are to be identified with. However, it will quite likely be objected that those are not the most interesting naturalisms, and they are certainly not how the most current naturalisms present themselves. One might think of naturalistic treatments of intentionality qua commitment, or of values or norms in general, as proceeding via discoverable identities, not definitional ones, discoverable identities between intentional properties of states and natural properties in states, and not proceeding via definitional claims about the meaning of normative terms, such as good and ought, belief, desire, etc. Here the open question argument will be quite ineffective. That is to say, one might think that there's a naturalistic reduction of good to some natural property via some a posterior identity claims, such as those we have for natural kinds, identities such as water equals H2O. This is a reduction which takes good to be a natural kind, and the term good to be a natural kind term, which is to be understood in terms of a roughly familiar causal theory of reference. Such a reduction, which is not dependent on senses or meanings or definitions, is not vulnerable to the open question argument, which only target definitional reductions. So someone may grant to us that G.E. Moore's argument and Kripke's Moorean argument, as I read Kripke, is fine as far as it goes, but object that it does not go far enough to overturn these other more current forms of naturalism that are based on a posteriori rather than definitional identities or reductions about value. So to complete the argument, therefore, we need to appeal to other styles of argument than the Moorean ones, and what immediately comes to mind are essentially Fregean arguments, which would count against these other forms, newer forms of naturalistic reduction. Suppose such a reduction appealed to some a posteriori identity for the form good equals x, where x was some natural property. Now, it's surely possible that someone may, without any irrationality, deny that good equals x, just as someone may deny without irrationality that Hesperus is phosphorus, or deny that London is Londres, or that water is H2O. Mere lack of information about astronomy or geography or chemistry or morals cannot make one irrational. But if someone can coherently and rationally and meaningfully say it's not the case that good is X, then we must ask what the term good in this meaningful statement means. Let them denote whatever it's supposed to, given the a posteriori identity. The point is that we need to posit a sense. We need to say what it connotes to find the statement coherent and rational, even if it's false. That shows that even in the identity statement good equals X, the term good has a sense. And now the question is, what is the sense, or what are these senses capturing? Are they expressing non-natural properties or some further natural properties over and above the ones that are denoted by the term? Suppose we say the former, that they express non-natural properties. Well, then the game is up for the naturalist. There's no reduction to natural properties. So he must have in mind, the naturalist must have in mind to say that these senses express some further natural properties over and above the natural properties that are denoted. But if we say that, then we are back once again to being vulnerable to Moore's open question argument. For now, good is being given a sense or meaning or definition, which is naturalistic, and that is exactly what the Morean-style argument undermined. So if the objection was that the Morean argument was fine as far as it went, but did not go far enough to overturn this more contemporary form of naturalism, the reply is that with the help of Frege, the Morean arguments can be made to go exactly that far. It looks then as if something like a pincer effect which is in play, which disallows any naturalistic reduction of normative notions, whether moral ones or those involved in intentionality. These reductions are either vulnerable to More-style arguments or Frege-style arguments. If one thought they were not vulnerable to the former, to the More-style arguments, it's only because one was enthralled to a naturalism that is susceptible to the latter. and we could only forestall the latter if one appealed to the very sorts of things, meanings, senses, definitions, which made one susceptible to the former, Morean arguments. So a pincer is the right word to describe it. You're susceptible to the More argument. You say, no, I'm not. I have a different conception of reduction. It's not through definitions, which More was targeting, but through a posteriori identities. Well, then you're susceptible to this complicated or looped Fregean argument. And if you respond to the Fregean argument's challenge by saying, well, they posit the senses or definitions express natural properties in order to remain a naturalist, well, you're back again susceptible to the More-style argument because now it's definitions which are being given, and that's what More was targeting. Okay, now I've said that Davidson does not make the identification of intentional states with values or commitments, which the More-Frege argument and the cleaner distinction as you find it in Kripke allows. Why doesn't Davidson say the clean thing that Kripke says? Because in Davidson's picture of the normative nature of intentionality, the principles of rationality govern our intentional states thought of as dispositions. This is Davidson's principle of non-optional charity. One way to describe this, if you can put up with an oxymoron or seeming oxymoron, is to say that as intentional subjects, we have non-optional commitments to the rational principles that guide our thinking. This much Davidson insists on and concedes. That is, Davidson concedes to you that we have commitments, but the only commitments we have are to the principles of rationality. Our desires and beliefs themselves are dispositions. We do have commitments, but they're only to the principles of rationality. He insists that the normative element of commitments is exhausted by these few governing commitments to the principles of rationality. And if so, there's no need to go on to clutter the mind with innumerable further commitments by saying that each intentional state is itself also a commitment. Okay? So this is the austere view of commitments. For the view that I'm proposing or reading Kripke as saying, our beliefs and desires are commitments. For Davidson, our beliefs and desires are not commitments, they're dispositions. But what makes them normative is that they are beholden to commitments we have, which are to the principles of rationality. But the austere view is, Davidson's austere view is that don't clutter the mind with innumerable commitments, all our beliefs and desires being commitments. The only commitments we have are to the principles of rationality, which govern, whatever that means, our disposition states, beliefs, and desires. So let's call that the austere view. We only are committed to principles of rationality. Nothing else is a commitment. But this austere position, that what we view as our normative states or commitments should be restricted to our commitments to the principles of rationality, is quite inadequate in doing what Davidson wants those principles of rationality to do, i.e., govern and guide our thought. Let me illustrate this with the notion of beliefs. Take, for instance, the following scenario. in which it would seem Davidson's austere picture of what commitments are restricted to gives quite the wrong instruction. Suppose someone believes that P, and suppose also that when a question is raised in a fit of distraction, he assents to something that is inconsistent with P. Now, on the austere view, the only instruction we get is get rid of the belief that P or withdraw the assent to not P. That is all the relevant principle of rationality can tell us to do. But given how I've set up the scenario, i.e. that he assents to not P in a fit of distraction, etc., given how I've set up the scenario, that is not the instruction one needs. One needs the instruction, withdraw the assent to not P. But the austere view cannot deliver that instruction. It's only delivered when we view beliefs themselves as commitments, the very thing denied by the austere view. I have, following Kripke, introduced the distinction between genuinely normative states or commitments and dispositions, with a view to claiming that intentional states are the former sorts of states. In saying this, I've been resisting Davidson, who would like to retain the idea of intentional states as dispositions and account for their normativity in other ways which I've claimed are, in the light of More's and Kripke's way of doing things, unnecessary and obscure. It's not enough to keep faith with what is established by More and Kripke to account for the normativity of intentional states by saying that their dispositions govern by principles of normativity. The only way to keep faith with it is to say that intentional states are themselves normative states, i.e. commitments or internal oughts. If we identify intentional states with normative states in this way, then their irreducibility is not some further irreducibility than the irreducibility of values to the facts of nature. It is the very same irreducibility. It is a special case of the irreducibility of values to natural facts as the natural sciences study them. And at the very least, something like Occam's principle should make us feel gratified by this outcome. But in fact, if the argument in the earlier part of the paper is correct, much more than Occam's principle recommends the view that desires are commitments. It is recommended by the substantial consideration that if desires are not dispositions but commitments, we are now allowed to say that unlike dispositions that are merely causal responses to the naturalistically conceived properties of the world, desires qua commitments are formed as responses to the normative demands of irreducibly valued properties of the world, and that, whether or not it is to be thought of as satisfyingly realist, is the position that I'd set out to establish. Thanks very much.